Hello. How's it been going for you? For me, one of the roles that I play necessitates that I leave a session, go backstage, and get ready for the next session. Obviously, I've been envying you as you've been sitting there listening to all those inputs and all those ideas that have been coming from the stage. And I was looking at the chat earlier, and there's some wonderful comments that were coming up, including one by G. Venkatraman, associate professor, who says the pandemic, due to obvious reasons, needed quick decision making. Has this, in any case, led to a process of over centralization in the name of quick decision making to tide over a crisis? Interesting point. We've got to think about that. There's one more, which was about from Vijay Bhatt, Manish Agarwal, who was speaking about dropping employee engagement is perhaps a concern, but there is also an opportunity to engage with bright people from tier two, three cities with huge commitment and desire to succeed. The great resignation, was it a great resignation, or in an Indian context, was that also about great gratitude? What about the migrants who walked back several miles to get back home? Those were some ideas that are still settling down and wrestling as I wrestle with those ideas and think about, wow, I mean, those are some interesting points that we need to think about. And as we were talking about one of those points, which is about the idea about sustainability in itself has been redefined by the pandemic and the economics of it shifted. That was one of the comments that came from Vikram in the earlier panel. And that led me to think the global economy has gone through a vortex of change in the last 2 years. Is it ripe for creative destruction, or will we go back to business as usual? To answer that and to build on those kinds of ideas, we have a fantastic panel, and that's going to be anchored by a very familiar name in policy circles, economists, and thought leaders, who's a group executive president and chief economist at the AV Birla Group, and columnist Dr. Ajit Ranade. So I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Ajit Ranade to take this over, introduce the other distinguished panel members, and then I'll see you back at 6:55. Over to you, Dr. Ajit.
Thank you, Kavi. Thank you for the kind introduction. And I'm delighted to be here. And I have two excellent panelists in conversation, Dr. Naushad Forbes, Co-Chairman of Forbes, and Professor A.K. Shiva Kumar, who actually is also visiting faculty at BITSoM and among other places like Harvard and Ashoka University. So the session is about reimagining the global economy. Is it ripe for creative destruction? The word creative destruction, as you know, comes from Schumpeter more than 100 years ago, about how capitalist economies, I think mainly in the context of capitalist economies, how innovation after innovations destroy existing industries and lead to new and more innovative industries. I mean, I guess he was thinking about how Kodak got replaced by digital cameras. I don't think he was thinking about the pandemic when he talked about creative destruction. You know, when we say reimagining the global economy, one has to think about, first of all, unimaginable things that have happened in the last 1 or 2 years. I mean, as Kavi gave you a few examples, I was thinking we are now at a situation where, in terms of the economy, the most valuable company in the world is worth $3 trillion, which is more than India's GDP, by the way. And India's GDP is among the third or fourth highest in the world. In fact, today, it's probably cheaper to buy an iPhone rather than one share of Apple. And I don't know if you know this, that the top 5 companies in the S&P 500, which is the broad-based index of the stock market, the top 5 companies, which includes, of course, Apple and Google and so on, their value is more than the bottom 282 companies or 290 companies. So that is another theme, which is an surprising and unimaginable things, the skew, the inequality just in stock market valuations. Many other interesting things. For example, last year when people got sick of being locked in or the lockdown, there are now services for flights to nowhere. Tickets are about $2,000. You board a flight, it's going to go nowhere. It just comes back to the same airport. But people were so itching to just get onto the flight to see the inside of an airport. So actually, these services are now becoming popular flights to nowhere. Could you have imagined that the Olympics almost got cancelled? Somehow or the other, we had it 1 year later, but I guess with very, very restrictive attendance. Or Kavi talked about the great resignation. Even as we speak about the global impact of the economy, of the lockdowns, actually, even as we speak right now, two of the largest economies in the world, China and the USA, are going to grow at around 5 or 6%, which is like a boom time. And that's why we have a huge labor shortage in the US. You are getting joining bonuses for even jobs like electricians and restaurant workers. And so I could just go on, but I thought before talking about the economy, we also have to talk about society at large. Some of the real defining and somewhat painful images from last year were those uh, long, the treks that of of uh, workers, informal from the informal sector, urban workers walking back to their villages because even the trains were not running, or even more sort of poignant images of corpses floating on the river. So those are also part of the images that we need to be cognizant of and we need to acknowledge. So I want to actually start with Professor Shiva Kumar. What is your perspective on how it has affected society, before we come to the economy? Because I'm also aware that in India, for example, 600 days and a large section of the students have not even attended school or even colleges. And then we, of course, our, the healthcare preparedness or unpreparedness got exposed during the Delta, the second wave. So what is your assessment of how the pandemic has affected us as a society?
Thank you, Ajit, and thank you for flagging these issues. Let me begin by pointing to three, which I think are major features of our development that COVID-19 has exposed us to. We were always concerned about the growing inequality, mostly income and wealth inequality. But with COVID, vaccine inequity has become a major challenge in global public health. I think with Omicron, we are seeing so many sad aspects of health injustice and health inequity. When you look at the hoarding and high consumption of vaccines by Western nations, and contrast this with the shockingly low levels of vaccination in Africa, where only around 10% of adults are fully vaccinated. The Lancet, which is a very famous medical journal, had warned, and I quote, if the practice of administering a third dose to all individuals older than 12 years becomes established in vaccine rich countries, it can aggravate supply shortages for other countries. In this scenario, under-vaccinated populations could generate the conditions for the emergence of new variants, which might not only be more infectious, but also exhibit greater immune escape, and those variants might enter into vaccine-rich countries to trigger fresh waves of infection. And this is not the kind of natural experiment the world would like to see, unquote. So we're really stuck in this situation today where imagine South Africa identified the new variant so quickly and immediately informed the global community within a matter of days. Contrast this with the Alpha variant, where the sample was taken in September 2020 from a patient in Kent. COVID was detected in November 2020, and the world was informed in December 2020. And for all that South Africa has done, we are punishing them with extensive travel restrictions for efficiency in analysis and reporting. The second point that I wanted to make was despite considerable progress, and we should not undermine across the world, and particularly in our region, what you see is not what you get. And I think that was a shocking revelation of the COVID-19, the fragility of the development foundations of most countries in this region. Why this region? High-income countries cannot get complacent when it comes to promoting health security. I mean, we have United States and United Kingdom floundering today, even as Bhutan and Vietnam seem to be doing reasonably well. So that also tells us that countries do not have to become rich first to reduce vulnerabilities and reduce insecurities. And finally, I think this is another thing which, when you look at the development from a people's perspective, COVID-19 has revealed the shallowness of the development paths followed by most countries. It has made one thing clear, Nothing matters more to people than security in their daily lives. And many governments seem to have abdicated this constitutional responsibility to people. Even in India, everyone seems obsessed about growth rates. You must have seen the headlines. We're touching 9.2%. Wow, that's remarkable, I must say. But we're not reimagining how best to learn from what COVID has taught us, how to rework solutions for establishing a more equitable, more just, and a fair society. So I'll
Thanks,
stop
Shiv. Yeah, thanks. These are, of course, these issues have come to the fore, especially inequality in all aspects, not just incomes and wealth, but access to healthcare, in digital inequality, and we'll come to that. And you rightly, pointed out that, for example, there was a situation where 60% of the global vaccines were with 5% of the global population. And as you know, vaccines have a finite life, so they actually get wasted if they're not used within the stipulated time. So that's fine. But on the other hand, we must not forget, and I want to come to Naushad on this, that, I believe the polio vaccine took some 20 or 30 years to develop. So there were predictions that the vaccine for COVID would take several years, a decade or longer. But surprisingly, and really it's a pleasant surprise, that not only did it get developed very rapidly, but this was an example of an incredible global cooperation led by private sector companies and researchers, of course, government partnerships. And we, in our own country, have a company in your own hometown, Naushad, which I think is largely responsible for India's 1.5 billion doses, even as we speak, and almost at free cost. So, how do you see that? I think that's something to be, really happy. I mean, celebrate that this private sector-led initiative to a rapid vaccine rollout, and hopefully it'll also reach countries which Shiv mentioned. That how did this happen? What is your assessment of this development?
So, if you look at vaccine development, it's an example. It's a great example of innovation, of very rapid innovation, of innovation that's been tremendously powerful and beneficial to humanity. And if you go back to you mentioned Ajit Schumpeter and creative destruction, which is very much his term. It's good to remember who Schumpeter identified as the creative destructors. The creative destructors were firms. One firm that did a better job than another firm. And how did they do a better job than another firm? By innovating. So innovation was at the heart of Schumpeter's creative destruction. It's at the heart of how societies progress. In the process, companies also get very rich. Serum Institute in Pune, as you mentioned, is not only the world's largest vaccine manufacturer. It's produced, as you mentioned, out of our 1.5 billion doses that we've administered in the country. I think I'm right in saying that 88% of them, so something like 1.35 billion, have been actually made by Serum Institute. And they took the call early on of investing in stockpiling vaccines before they had a single order from anyone, and to go ahead with that development. It was a statement of entrepreneurship, a statement of risk taking, a statement of actually betting on the future, which has really paid off. And it's paid off for the company in terms of its own success, but it's also paid off for us as a country and for humanity in providing us with this scale of vaccine manufacturing. So I think it's good to keep coming back in all our concerns about inequality, in our concerns, and they're legitimate concerns. But may I suggest that we should be more concerned about those who are being left behind than inequality in itself. We should be more concerned about poverty and a lack of basic needs being met than about the inequality between people and firms. If you have high levels of innovation creates the opportunity for rents. It's the classic economic incentive to invest in R&D, invest in product development. It's through innovation that companies build fortunes, families build their fortunes. The same has happened with vaccines. You see this with vaccines in India. You see this with vaccines with BioNTech in Germany. You see this, with two Turkish entrepreneurs innovating with mRNA vaccines. You see this with Moderna with the mRNA vaccine there again in Switzerland.
That's
This
right.
is a reflection of innovation.
So, in fact, you're right. This itself is the place where we are seeing tremendous innovation. But I want to widen that discussion and stay with you, Naushad, on the fact that one of the trends which was prior to the pandemic is the digital. The increasing digital footprint in the economy, the great increasing share of the what we call the digital part of the economy. That just has got accelerated, not just because of work from home practice or using cloud-based services, not just e-commerce, but even, I guess it's coming to even manufacturing. So do you see that now getting accelerated as we talk about reimagining our economy, our global economy? What is the role of the digital aspect?
It really has. I mean, when we used to see VCs as something that we did as a kind of new thing, a novelty. Coming into the pandemic, yes, we'd have them from time to time, but they were, a couple a week. One or two people who would be based remotely who would call in for our weekly meetings and so on. It's now become the way in which we live our lives and how we operate every day. And for me, I'm clear that my life going forward, even when, I'll say when, not if, when the pandemic eventually goes away and we can move around as much as we wish, I'm not going to go back to the way I used to live. The days when I would go to Delhi for almost every week and for one meeting of 1 hour or 2 hours. I mean, what a waste of life. I think we should use our ability to move around as a way of building relationships that are deep, spending time with people that matter. It's got nothing to do with digital, and use digital as a way or as an efficiency tool, as something that actually creates time in our schedules such that we have time to do things that really matter. And for me, the things that really matter won't be digital.
So, they say that before the pandemic, the one statistics I've read, they said that about 5% of the people were working remotely, and now it is up to 40%. And something like 25 or 27% of the firms were giving flexi time, people to come. Now that is up to 88%. But this is as far as the harnessing, capturing, sort of exploiting the digital trends. But the flip side, and I want to bring Shiv Kumar here. Shiv, there is this aspect of, I know that Naushad said that, I heard him say that we should care more about poverty reduction before we look at inequality. And I think he meant income inequality. But there's this new trend of digital divide, that as we have a higher digital footprint, in fact, there is a very real expanding divide called the digital divide, whether it's digital literacy or access to bandwidth, access to smartphones, even the schooling. As I guess affluent kids have been able to switch over to schooling from home or over the internet, but it's created a huge digital divide. How do we think we can address this growing digital divide?
Sure. Ajit, before that, I just wanted to react to Naushad on the private sector's contribution in the vaccine space. I think we really have to acknowledge the remarkable work of scientists and the private sector that has so rapidly developed these vaccines. I mean, it's quite amazing, mind-boggling. But while we acknowledge that, the contribution of innovation and the scientific community, what the COVID also exposed, sadly, was the extraordinary gaps in the government provisioning of healthcare in this country. And, we are spending only 1.3% of GDP, that's the public spending on health. And it really exposed what it means for private out-of-pocket expenditures. And so when you say that India is a country where almost 60% is private out-of-pocket expenditures for most people, it is very highly impoverishing. So when Naushad talks about poverty, you have to start with health itself and say, hey, listen, what did it tell us? I know very large middle-class families whose parents and others were admitted in COVID wards in private hospitals out of no option and are completely in debt today. And so, and hit with joblessness. How are you going to pay your loans? How are you going to send your kids to private schools? It is a real crisis, and it stems from this fundamental fact that security of individuals, security in the lives of people, has to start with health security. And that we haven't, it's not the fault of the private sector at all. I'm just saying that it is how all of us everywhere has to push for universal health coverage, and that is state provided, and you co-opt the private sector to the best abilities. I'm talking about the good private sector because private sector is so heterogeneous, and we also heard stories of how they were ripping off people with false medicines and overcharging and so on and so forth. There is no regulation and so on, but we have to really work together to get this right.
On this point, Shiv, the universal health insurance, the Ayushman Bharat, don't you think that it's pre-pandemic, but of course that's probably
Yeah.
going in the right direction, right?
Well, one doesn't know about, there's always limitations to an insurance scheme because no country in the world has, United States is a good example where you have private insurance companies, private hospital care, and so on. And that is the most inefficient and ineffective in terms of reach of healthcare to the poor. So we have to reimagine. We really have to reimagine beyond an insurance program where the government says, hey, listen, we will pay the premium for the poor. And you and me and everyone else, you fend for yourself like the Americans do, take private medical insurance and go to private hospitals. But that is, no country has been able to achieve universal health coverage without a very strong public sector in health, primary healthcare, preventive healthcare, and also secondary and tertiary healthcare.
So surely
we can top it up. Yeah. But let me come back
to a wake-up call to increase, but to increase healthcare spending. But let's get on digital divide.
Yeah. Just very quickly, I couldn't raise myself from saying it's an opportunity for us to reimagine healthcare provisioning in India.
Absolutely.
Coming to the digital divide, Ajit, you raised all the concerns. But when you come into a household, a poor household, they cannot afford 3-4 smartphones. All right. Even the wife at home does not have a smartphone. Often it's the husband who takes it away to work, and there's one phone being shared. And then you have the divide, the gender divide comes in. You have boys and girls at home, and the boys are typically given priority, especially if you're an older boy who says, okay, you do your follow the class. So what this digital divide is, of course, there's a huge problem of access, electricity connection, bandwidth, paying for all this, and so on and so forth. But there's a great there is an educational crisis. People have noticed the health crisis, but there's a parallel educational crisis that UNICEF and others have highlighted, where we're going to find a whole 2 years or 3 years, a generation of children who have absolutely learned very little in school. And by the time we gear up to getting everybody access to tablets and smartphones, that is going to take a long time. So I worry about it, and we have to again come back to the emphasis on government schools, because with many families not earning money now, they have not just gotten back their jobs. How do they send children to private schools? How do you afford it? And there is a state responsibility of providing universal free schooling. And today, India is one country where almost 50% of children are going to private schools. And no country targets that, let's move to 100% private schooling. Even the richest nations in the world, in Europe, not more than 10 to 12% attend private schools.
The government has made a priority to actually increase connectivity to schools. And I guess in some municipalities and some governments, they're also thinking of giving tablets to students. Do you think that will at least make a dent in the...
It should. It should in every way. It should make a dent. But because you're large numbers in a large country, the challenge of public finance comes up. Where are you going to get the money to pay for all this? Then there's a question of shifting priorities. And that's what the lesson is, that we have to reallocate, rethink financial priorities. We have ignored health and basic education for too long. This is really the moment, the opportunity, and the challenge.
The other trend that has happened, I'm going to bring Naushad here. By the way, I saw a comment by Charles on the chat box saying reimagine insurance. And I'm thinking, yes, in fact, not just insurance, but the entire financial sector is going to be reimagined, because we have this phenomenon of blockchain, which is disintermediating a lot of the paperwork and contracting. But we'll come back to that later in the session. But Naushad, the other session is... other trend is about the MSMEs, the micro, small, and medium enterprises. So one of the trends in the Indian economy is what is called the formalization, the movement of firms from informal to the formal sector. But we have something like 65 million micro, small, and medium enterprises in the country, and I guess a large part of that would be counted as the informal sector. This formalization, which has, I think, got accelerated during the pandemic, we are seeing corporate results are extremely healthy. In fact, banking balance sheets have improved, but at the same time, we are seeing the MSME sector is in pain. And so, how do you see how will the reimagination happen in that part? Do we just push? Don't large corporates require MSME suppliers, ancillaries? And how will that transition to formal sector happen without more pain to them?
So, I mean, I'm not a big believer in formalization. I'm a big believer in economic activity that puts people to productive work, right? Whether they are employed in formal enterprises or informal enterprises, I think is the second order question, right? And I think if you look at what's happened during the pandemic, it is informal workers who've lost their jobs. And they've particularly lost their jobs because of the sectors that employ millions and millions of informal workers. So, for example, what are the consequences that we've seen of the pandemic? Roughly 10 million fewer jobs in manufacturing, right? So 40 million coming down to about 30 million. Those 10 million jobs that have been lost have been largely in MSME manufacturing. What else have we seen? Large numbers of job losses in retail, one among our single biggest employers. Large job losses in hospitality, and hospitality is not fancy restaurants and five-star hotels. It's everything from a small tea shop on the side of the road through to smaller places where migrant workers would actually eat. So it's a range of employment-intensive activities, largely in the informal sector, that was driving a lot of our economic activity for much of the last 20 years, which is where we saw, which took the brunt of the pain that the pandemic and the lockdowns caused. So what should we do? I think we need to find ways that are imaginative to provide a basic level of insurance. The reimagining insurance comment, providing a basic level of insurance at very, very low cost, a small premium in terms of the wage that one pays, which then provides for a certain degree, a certain amount, maybe it's 3 months of base minimum wage insurance, a minimum of health insurance for the individual and their family, and a certain degree of security that at the end of that period of disruption, they have their jobs back.
So it's unemployment insurance, right?
Yes, exactly. So that's something that I think we need to do in a voluntary way. We're trying to do this, by the way, through CAI among a few firms in the Western region, and we hope that can actually become a kind of model that attracts others to also participate in that kind of an effort, where you provide voluntarily this coverage for all informal people, because people in our firms who are formally employed are protected. They didn't suffer.
That's right. But that's a tiny fraction.
It's the small firms, it's the security firms, it's the people delivering food home, it's the people working in small shops and restaurants. They're the ones who suffered, and they're the ones who need that base level of protection. So I do think we need to reimagine that. I want to make a mention also about Shiv's point on primary education and health. It is a big role for the state. I fully agree with him that actually investment in public health you see, the Ayushman scheme, right, is really it will provide, it addresses the question of how you pay for hospitalization.
That's right.
But that's not about public health. That's after you fall sick and then need to go to hospital. It's useful, it's important, it's necessary to have. But public health is providing clean drinking water. It's about providing sanitation. It's about providing vaccinations. That's a part of a good, active public health program. We can do much better in our public health work. We do quite well in some states like Kerala. We do terribly in some other states, especially in the Bimaru states, if you like. So we need to do a better job across the country in terms of our public health outcomes. The same for education. Yes, the pandemic showed this up very drastically, but I think the part that we're missing is that when we keep schools closed, the children that suffer the most are the poor children. And in a sense, by keeping schools closed and keeping ourselves safe as a result, we are penalizing the poorest people in the country. And I think it's something that we should reflect on, and something that we maybe need to say, listen, if we want to keep them closed, let us, who are benefiting from the children not going to school and not exposing us to the spread of a virus, let's pay for them to get tablets.
So, I mean, in fact, that's a comment which I find even Piyul Mukherjee has made, that by by going digital and preventing kids from going to school, she says it's prevented actually innovation. But I also want to bring in Shiv. See, it's not just. I mean, I'm going to, for the timing, ignore the fiscal aspect. If we say that we have to increase healthcare and education spending, if the government is going to do that, then we need to worry about where that money is going to come from, unless it's going to be reallocated. But vocational education, a large, I mean, it's not just primary education, but vocational education. We still haven't sort of cracked that, right? How are we going to reimagine? As you know, and I'm sure Naushad will agree, most of the learning, as far as vocational learning is concerned, it's on the job. It's in fact not in school, not in the technical training institutes. How are we going to crack that? And a large section of these students who will benefit are not going to be able to afford the kind of tuition you need for vocational education. So,
thanks, Ajit.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Very quickly to react to Naushad, one aspect that we also find of children not going to school is the psychological and mental health challenges that it is posing to adolescents. So you're just sitting there, you can't talk to your friends, you don't even have a cell phone with whom to communicate. So we really have to also, in that health dimension, worry about the mental health issues. And a lot of counseling is taking place by many agencies, advising young boys and young girls on what it means to get locked up. But coming back to the education, the employment, and the fact that 85% of the workforce is in the informal sector, I completely agree with Naushad that we have to reimagine the idea of a job, and that means a decent job. I mean, we can't just, numbers numb, as they say. That's the role of a number. 10 million, 12 million jobs a year. I mean, you can't even sit here imagine what 10 million jobs, creating 10 million, 12 million jobs, and who's creating it and where. It has to be in the private sector. So we have to really think of reimagining the numbers game with decent jobs, with the kind of insurance and social security that Naushad is talking about. And I fully endorse that. But I also want to point out a very serious crisis on women's employment in this country. 80% of the women are working in the informal sector, and COVID has really hit them very hard. And today, only about 20% of women are in the active labor force participation rate. And that is less. There are only 8 or 9 countries that report lower rates than India. And most of these, as you would imagine, are in the Middle Eastern Islamic societies. And we know that women don't have that kind of freedom. But the denial of opportunities for young women, to young girls and women to pursue education and employment is a serious matter. And I think McKinsey and others have forecasted that if we had more women participating in the workforce, we would have, our GDP would go up so many more times, even if GDP is a measure of well-being, which I have a problem with. So how do you create conditions of work for women, young girls to pursue education and get decent jobs where there is safety in the workplace is a major concern. Finally, coming to the skill, there is a mismatch between demand and supply. I'm told that in Korea, 96% of the engineers who graduate are employable. I'm told the corresponding figure for India is about 3-4%. So our education system needs to be refixed, but skilling cannot be a substitute for good quality basic education. So it cannot happen that we go through 10 years of school and you and I can't find a job. So you say, okay, now let me become a plumber or an electrician or something. So it is equally important to focus on the basics and fundamentals of basic education, and then absolutely with vocational education, because not everybody wants to become a professor. I know that. So yes, absolutely right. But let's not in the pursuit of pushing skill development ignore the crisis in basic schooling and school education.
So Naushad, this is the one of the very big important very big important issue is the jobs. And, on hand, we're talking about in the US, there's this phenomenon of great resignation and labor shortage. But the fact is that India's growth, as Shiv also said, has been, if not jobless, has not created enough jobs to commensurate with the growth of the economy. In fact, India's labor force participation rate has dropped to almost 40 or 42%. And like Shiv said, women's participation is even lower at 20%.
20.
And as someone in the audience has said, I think, was it Satish or someone who said that it's actually going to be a lot of the manufacturing jobs are vulnerable to automation. We are going to lose them. Vijay Bhatt said that. How do you think this future, the reimagined future, looks for job creation? Because that's going to be a very big ask for the Indian economy. Which sectors?
So if you look at what's happened in the last 25, 30 years, we have created millions of jobs, but we've created millions of these informal service sector jobs to a very large extent. Very few jobs have been created in formal manufacturing. And indeed, while we've created jobs in formal services, IT and banking and so on, those numbers pale relative to the jobs we've created in retail and hospitality and tourism and so on. So that's where we've created millions of jobs. Now, what does it take to do much more in the employment area? I would come back again to providing basic needs. So I agree with Shiv, providing a basic good schooling is the number one thing that one can do in the long run to create an employable population. Yeah? It's the first thing that one can do. Second thing that one can do is try to make it easier for labor-intensive sectors to prosper. What are those labor-intensive sectors? So if you take manufacturing, it's things like footwear and garments. Footwear, garments, food processing. These are the employment-intensive sectors. You see many of these firms moving factories and production out of China as their wages rise. But they're going to Ethiopia, they're going to Bangladesh, they're going to Vietnam. They're not coming to India, because India has so far not been an attractive destination for labor-intensive manufacturing. We should figure out what it takes to become a better destination for labor-intensive manufacturing. The government put through, in September 2020, some useful labor reforms. Those labor reforms those laws need to be notified first by the union government and then by all state governments. They've still not been notified. There's some useful reforms. We should see them as the first step in moving in the direction of balance, flexibility, and protection. Yeah.
Do you think labor reform is holding the creation of jobs, labor laws?
I think it's, it doesn't affect you and me, Ajit. It doesn't affect Birla. It doesn't affect Forbes Marshall because of the sectors that we've ended up in. It does affect someone running a garment factory. If someone running, why is it that a large garment factory in India employs 3,000 to 5,000 people? A large garment factory in Bangladesh employs 30,000 to 50,000 people. A large garment factory in China employs 100,000 people. So, you need to make it possible. Now, you might say, listen, these are sweatshops in Bangladesh. They are. But given the choice, people, and by the way, women dominate in the garment sector in Bangladesh, people choose to walk off their fields and into these sweatshop every time. So I think we should create those same opportunities, get rid of some of the hang-ups that we have about, hey, listen, sweatshops, etc. Create that employment. Yes, there'll be some problems that come along with it. We'll sort those problems out as we go along. And then a final thing is tourism. I think tourism is our great untapped opportunity in India. We could be the world's number one tourist destination based on what we actually have in terms of architecture, natural beauty, everything, right? Um, it needs the kind of drive and focus between union and state governments with active private sector participation to turn us from whatever it is, country number 15 or something like that in the world tourism rankings. We should be country number one. We shouldn't be attracting 12 million tourists a year. We should be attracting 100 million tourists a year,
That's right.
more than what France does.
No, absolutely. I think without a doubt, labor-intensive sectors. It was Mohan Natarajan, by the way, who said about the danger of automation. But as you said, garment making is going to be around for quite some time. It's even though there may be automation, and you know what they say about sweatshops. Or I don't know if it's attributed to Karl Marx. The only thing worse than getting exploited is not getting exploited.
Yeah, exactly.
So at this stage of our development, so labor-intensive sectors like garment, footwear, tourism. I don't want to miss the opportunity of asking you about, and Shiv, I'll come back to you on the role of the corporation. So we are going to try and wrap up in a few minutes. But one is about the future. Reimagining the global economy cannot be reimagined without the concept of digital finance and digital currencies, crypto assets, and it's reached the prime minister and even the cabinet that they had to start. They're thinking about a bill. So how real is that, Naushad, and what does it mean for India's economy?
So I'm going to pass the question to Shiv, because I do not claim to begin to understand cryptocurrencies.
Shiv, you want to? I know it's a very esoteric topic, blockchains, and what the Reserve Bank of India is thinking of introducing a digital currency very soon.
Yeah. If Naushad is giving it a pass, how would I comment on it?
Okay, let's move on. I know that the reason I mention it is because this is something which may take us by surprise. It's when we say about reimagining the global economy, certainly the fact that India's UPI, this Google Pay, you go to even a vegetable vendor and you say you run out of change, you say, why don't you pay me by Google Pay? So UPI transactions in India today are running at something like, I don't know, 25 billion or something per year, which is even far ahead of China. And very soon we are going to have a central bank digital currency. So it's going to really, completely upturn the digital finance as we know it. But another topic which I think I'm sure both of you will have a lot to say, and this is the role of the corporation as a citizen. A corporation as a citizen of society or citizen of the economy. That is, we used to think that the corporations do their thing, and we talked about how Shiv said health and education spending in India needs to go up, but it's here that corporations can step up. When it comes to climate change, it's not only regulations and laws, but it's also proactively the corporation, the private sector can take up the agenda of green agenda. So how do you see at least one thing? So we'll start with Shiv. In this reimagined economy, what is the role of this corporation? Is it going to be held more accountable for stuff which was conventionally not its domain?
Let me also, I think we're also running out of time, so let me make these my last few comments as well. I think what I'm arguing for is that we need to accelerate economic growth, but ensure that some of the revenues, additional revenues generated by growth, are now reprioritized into investments in basic health, basic education, minimum standards of living, and effective social protection systems. Where does the corporate sector come in? I think through the CSR and other activities, the government with the best of intentions cannot reach the poorest in this country. These are broad systems. And I think that connecting that last mile is a very critical requirement in the years to come. And I think that the corporate sector has the technology, has the financial capabilities, has the bandwidth to imagine how to get that done better. So that is one. The second one, I think, is we definitely need much larger public debate and discussion. I've raised the role of the state. I think you're also asking the role of the corporate sector. I think the COVID pandemic has really shown how, if we all work together and bring in members of civil society also, we can tackle a crisis. But we don't have to have a crisis for all of us to come together to work together. So I really see a much bigger and a much more responsible role for the formal corporate sector to participate. Even when you say FICCI and CII, they are large representative organizations, but to reimagine how they can partner with civil society organizations and push for this. And I think that's, and finally I want to say that the real change in the India will come when you have community level changes. It's not at the level of policy and global thinking, but what is happening to people and communities and households at the village level. And there our own administrative capacities are really weak. So I see a very strong role for the corporate sector and for CSR activities to support non-governmental organizations and others, even support research and evaluation in terms of what works, what is not working, to ensure that we move away from this high-level conversation to really focusing on local actions that can make a difference to the daily lives of people, ordinary people. Thank you.
Thanks, Shiv. So I'm going to give the last word to Naushad. So corporations, as Shiv said, actually corporations are not only under pressure from laws regarding CSR or whatever taxation, but they're actually under pressure from shareholders themselves. ESG, as you know, ESG is the sort of new marker. They're under pressure from customers. Consumers want greener products, and they are now under pressure from youngsters who don't want to join a company if it is not environmentally, doing sound things. So, do you think that's going to change the role of the corporation in society?
Well, I think you've had good companies for many years, and good companies take a long-term view. They take a view not only of what their short-term results have to be, but of what's good for the community, because they recognize that what's good for the community is the best way of building a successful, sustainable, long-term business. And this is true whether it comes to, for example, investing in education. Again, we're trying to do a project where we ensure second standard outcomes for every child, because it's a good government scheme, but where companies can particularly help. This doesn't cost much. Where companies can particularly help is in last mile delivery and implementation. And if we can implement in all the villages near where our factories are, we can make quite an impact on education outcomes for people, because that's how we can then include many more millions in our growth story. The second thing is, at the end of the day, if we have a sense of community, if we have a sense that we're meant to, if the pandemic has taught us anything, it's how connected we all are. That you can't keep yourself safe in your house if the staff who work there live in slums. So do something about the slums they live in, right? And make sure that they don't live in slums, right? So, these are things that we should see as requirements for us to engage with, and recognize that we will all be taken care of when we take care of everyone around us.
Absolutely. I think this is so the enlightened corporation which understands that our fates are intertwined. In fact, as you said, the pandemic, the virus has really brought it very starkly that everybody is connected in that sense. So I think, since we are almost, completely out of time, so thank you. I thank the panelists. There are many themes that came up. One theme that I'm going to mention again is the importance of health and education spending, mostly from the public sector, but which will also be dividends from higher economic growth. Secondly, about vocational training and job growth, and focus on the labor-intensive, export-oriented sectors like tourism, garment, footwear. That's a very important thing. And of course, then finally, the role of the enlightened corporation, which sees its own fate intertwined with that of the community or society at large. So thank you very much, Naushad and Shiv. I enjoyed having this conversation with you, and I hope our audience also benefited a lot. And good evening to all of you. Thank you.
Thank you.
It's back
Thank
to
you,
Kavi.
Ajit.
Thank you.
Thanks, Naushad.
Bye. How do you?
Back to Kavi.
Yes, thank you. It was a fascinating conversation, Dr. Ranade. It was fantastic to listen to you and to all the panelists. Um, for many, many years, one of my goals has been to develop a well rounded point of view. In a very short time, we've had very different points of views that have come. Where do you start? I mean, what are we concerned about? Who's left behind? What about health? For instance, one of the points that came up for me as I was reading the other day was Pfizer made $35 billion out of the pandemic. Uh, is that fair? Where do we start? Basic education before skilling. And there's this wonderful phrase which came up, which I've made a note of, which is numbers numb. I think Vijay Bhatt had a wonderful comment which went on about numbers numb, which is why we sometimes lack the humanness after looking at a number. What about gender divide? What about labor intensive manufacturing? And as I was scrolling through the comments on the other side, I was also seeing Satish make a very important point about mental health is a national crisis and no one's calling it out. And Venkat, who made a comment about mental health in the context of intergenerational divide, is a much bigger issue. And then, of course, I was left with this thought about how long can we say that, look, I mean, I need to understand crypto better. And these are things that I'm going to take away and converse with a lot more people and build on. And by the way, this happens to be the first day of Beacon 2021, 2022. Now, by the way, this festival is called Beacon. Now, what's a beacon? A beacon is a light of fire or a place that's easy to see, that's on top of a hill, that acts as a warning or a signal. Now, if it is to act as a warning or a signal, then we better have some ideas and thoughts to make it as robust as possible. Now, that can come only with all of us contributing to it. And what we're going to request for is something from you that you are left with, ideas and thought that you are left with in tweet-worthy terms, which is about 140 characters. If and only if we are giving you an opportunity to think of two ideas that you are left with that you'd want to build on, what would those be? Please pop it into your chat window, and as we're just going to keep looking at these ideas and see how we're going to leave it back with the community of all of us to just think about those ideas and build on them and possibly go out and talk to more people about those ideas, because it's important for us to not only hear these ideas from the bright minds on stage but also from each other, because ideas from one side gives us a certain dimension, certain perspective, but ideas from all of us helps us navigate and helps us make it far better, far more stronger. And I recall one of the things that Professor Banerjee in his opening remarks talked about diversity. He spoke about cognitive diversity far beyond an identity diversity. And therefore, it's important that we get your ideas that are diverse as to what are you taking away from these two sessions thus far. Please pop it into the chat window, and I'll try to get a few of them right now. And even as I get a few of them, we'll start preparing for our next conversation. And that's an interesting conversation that's coming up. And I see two comments which are out here, which is what is the minimum safety net? Vijay again has written, what's the minimum safety net that we need for people to feel secure and therefore motivated to contribute rather than just survive? That's a beautiful idea. We all need to think about that. And there's one more from Sridhar, which is about we need people from corporates doing things in an organized fashion. The time versus just money. It's a fantastic. I think more comments will keep coming up in the chat window. Please do pop your comments in. It's important for us for all of us, all of you in the room to just ideate, grab these thoughts and work with these thoughts as you start thinking about not only what you're receiving from yourself but what you're receiving from everyone around. Now, as you're processing these thoughts and Yes, Venkatraman is asking the other question: how do we address the digital divide? Well, that's a big question. I think Piyul's comment that was picked up by Dr. Ajit was also about, is the presence of digital and the ease of digital for certain households, has it stopped innovation from happening? That's an important question. I didn't realize that there were 50%, 50% of kids in India go to private schools. And then Mr. G. Venkatraman, professor in IIM Indore, asked about growth with justice, and we are safe only when others around us are safe. So, fantastic comments that are coming up here, and I would request you to keep these comments going. And after the end of the last session, which we're just going to get into now, we'll harvest these comments together and possibly we'll try and do something with them. And it's going to be important for us, as I keep saying, to look at all our collective comments as a way of processing what's coming from the speakers here. And that was the worth of having coffee breaks, if you will, when we went to large conferences, because we got to discuss about what got discussed inside the conference. Now, the chat window offers us that opportunity here. Well, let's keep the comments going there. But right now, we're going into the next conversation. It's an interesting conversation that I've been really looking forward to this as well. If you're going to sing a new tune, if you were to call it that, and to take us into that area, we have somebody very interesting for all of us to dive into the next session. And so how do I introduce him? Well, we've looked at change, we've heard economics, and we are getting into or breaking into a different song, perhaps. We have for this session the visiting faculty of BITSoM, the professor from the University of Texas in Austin, who's written a book that became a bestseller. And he's also amongst, and that went on to become a course on Coursera. And the title of the book is a fantastic question, a question that I love to ask many people. And that question goes like, if you are so smart, why are you not happy? Well, that's a brilliant question. That's a great title of the book as well. Now, I'm going to leave you with Professor Raj Raghunathan. Professor Raj Raghunathan for a much awaited session. And this is going to be a session that you'll all enjoy. But I'm going to be back in about 50 minutes or so, and I'm going to come back to you and talk to you a little bit about what kind of things have you picked up from this session. And what we'll do at the end of all three sessions is for us to think about and work with tweet-worthy small quotes, quips, ideas that you're going back with. And if you can share them on the chat window, it's going to be useful for us to create some kind of a dashboard, from which all of us can process whatever came from stage and whatever ideas and wisdom exists in the audience as well. So together it becomes a body of conversation for us to build ideas on. Remember, this is Beacon 2022, and that's the hashtag as well. If any of you want to tweet, and we will get now into the session. And let's get into the session now. May I request the organizers to call in Professor Raj Raghunathan for the session.